Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Humanitarian Parole Next Steps webinar. Welcome.us is holding this session in partnership with the American Immigration Lawyers Association, AILA, for humanitarian parole sponsors to understand alternative legal status options for newcomer beneficiaries. My name is Krista Kartson, and I am the Senior Director for Sponsorship Initiatives here at Welcome.us. And Welcome.us is a national initiative built to inspire, mobilize, and empower Americans to welcome and support those seeking refuge here and help them thrive. The response from all corners of the country has been remarkable. We estimate that over 2 million sponsors have raised their hands to welcome newcomers through humanitarian parole pathways, which is what brings us here together today. For today's discussion, we will be joined by Liz Kemery, my colleague here at Welcome.us and a fellow humanitarian parole sponsor. Liz will be guiding us through many questions that you all have raised regarding alternative status options for newcomers. And as I mentioned, this webinar is presented in partnership with the American Immigration Lawyers Association. AILA is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, voluntary bar association that provides continuing legal education, professional services, information, and expertise to more than 16,000 attorneys who practice and teach immigration law. And joining us from AILA, we are privileged to hear from Dree Kalapi today. Our guest speaker is an immigration legal expert from Banak Kalapi LLP in Washington, D.C., a recognized expert on U.S. immigration law, particularly humanitarian relief. Dree chaired AILA's Asylum and Refugee Committee for 9 years, is the author of AILA's Asylum Primer, and teaches asylum and refugee law at American University's Washington College of Law. Again, this webinar is for humanitarian parole sponsors, specifically Uniting for Ukraine and the processes for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. During our session, we'll learn more about the discretionary nature of humanitarian parole status, the importance of and options for alternative legal status, understand what resources are available for you as sponsors and for newcomers in navigating these options, and understand considerations for when and how to pursue legal services. The information that will be shared in this session is not relevant for Welcome Corps sponsors, which is a separate private sponsorship pathway affiliated with the United States Refugee Admissions Program. We cannot comment on individual cases today, and this session is not intended as legal advice. This webinar is being recorded for your reference and for the benefit of those who could not join us today. After the session, you will receive a follow-up email with relevant links and the recording. And if you are viewing this webinar as a recording, welcome. Relevant links are in the video description. We welcome your questions in the Zoom Q&A function, and we will seek to address as many as we can during our time today. If we do not address them today, your questions are still valuable in informing future events and materials that we share with you. As you are all aware, humanitarian parole is a temporary status that can be authorized by a president to help people facing emergency humanitarian crises or other national interests. The two sponsorship programs established with Humanitarian Parole Authority are Uniting for Ukraine and the processes for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. Humanitarian parole is granted for 2 years, and the status does not include a permanent pathway to remain in the United States. Because of this temporary nature, it's important for recipients of humanitarian parole to consider and apply for alternative status options for which they are eligible as soon as possible. People who have received status through some of the alternative pathways that we will explore today, such as asylum or the Cuban Adjustment Act, will not experience the same change in legal status that is inherent to humanitarian parole. At this point, I'm now going to hand it over to Liz and Dree to continue our conversation today. Thank you both.
Thank you, Krista. As Krista said, I am a member of the Welcome US team, but before I joined the Welcome team, I was a sponsor. our family chose to sponsor a Ukrainian family in 2022. And the experience truly changed our lives, and we remain very close with them. So, like many of you, I've had a lot of concerns and questions about the role that I play as a sponsor in helping our newcomers prepare for the next steps for 2025. So I'm very excited to have this conversation with Dree today and get her expertise and her suggestions for what next steps are. Thank you so much, Dree, for being here today. Are you ready to get started?
I'm ready, and thank you so much for having me. And just to the audience, I just want to say a note of thanks as well. And during these really dark times around the world where there's more forced displacement than ever in history, it's really inspiring to know that there's so many good people out there who want to support people and support our neighbors and recognize our common humanity and just show kindness generally in welcoming newcomers to the United States who, need a pathway to flee violence and war and other things and to reunite with their families. So thank you all for what you do, and know that there's a support network out there for you and the people that you've sponsored in the future to help you kind of navigate the labyrinth of our immigration laws here in the U.S. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And as I shared, our family did sponsor someone through the Uniting for Ukraine program, and I'm sure we have plenty of people on the call today who also welcome families through the processes for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. So to start off, can you share what we can expect from a new administration and if the people we sponsored will be able to stay in the country legally?
Yeah, so, right now there's not much that's certain. And I think that, in my office, what we've been experiencing, especially since the election, given all the rhetoric that surrounded immigration during the campaigns, we've just been receiving a lot of panicked phone calls, people who are both people sponsoring newcomers, but also, people who are here as immigrants, even people who are here legally that are just very concerned about, what the future holds. And I want to just emphasize to everyone that you shouldn't panic and know that, there are options for people, and there are, teams of people around the country who are going to be navigating the laws and any kind of policy changes and providing useful guidance. So you all are doing the right thing in joining the call today to learn about what some potential options might be and to get a plan in place. And I think that that's really the best step to do right now when everything is so uncertain. Humanitarian parole is discretionary. And what that means is that the administration can make changes to the program without a change in the law through Congress. And so changes to humanitarian parole can happen very quickly at the whim of whoever's in charge in the executive branch. So we have heard that the new administration wants to end the humanitarian parole programs. We don't know exactly what that means or when that will happen. We also don't know if it will be an end to all humanitarian parole programs or just the ones impacting certain nationalities. So right now, like I said, what you're doing is in getting more information and educating yourselves is exactly what you should be doing, and just putting the pieces in place to react quickly if and when those changes do come.
I appreciate that. I know that I think my initial reaction was a little bit of panic, but as we're gaining more information and thinking through all the different possibilities, and especially with advice like this, it's been very helpful to kind of consider what's next. And so if we think about if humanitarian parole does end, does that mean that the newcomers that we welcomed will lose their legal status?
Yes, so that's also a little bit uncertain. If they do end the humanitarian parole programs, there's multiple possibilities. They could say, everyone who has it now, you don't have it automatically right now. Like it's ended, it's revoked entirely. They could say people who are on parole can just ride out the remaining validity of their status, but there's not going to be any kind of re-parole or renewal of that. They could say it's just that we're not going to welcome any new people who haven't already entered. So we don't know there's any kind of level of ending the programs, but if it does end or parole is revoked, yes, people will, lose the status that they've received through the programs, and they should. So, preparing for that kind of worst case scenario is wise at this time, just given what we know of the plans of the incoming administration. And again, it's possible that it'll be country specific, or it could be, all the countries that have received humanitarian parole. We just don't know at this time.
Yeah, I know there's still a lot of unknowns, which I think, can sometimes make it challenging to determine what those next steps are. So, would you say that, again, if humanitarian parole were to end and that legal status does go away, does that mean that the people that we've welcomed they might be facing being deported, or what would that look like?
Yeah, so it's, again, we don't exactly know, but I think we can anticipate, given the rhetoric, that the programs will be impacted in some way, and that people should get their plans in place sooner rather than later. Risk of deportation, there's all the talk in the media about mass deportation plans and all of that. I think that the legal answer is yes. If someone loses humanitarian parole, they're here without valid status or without authorization, and that they are at risk of deportation. But the realities and the practicalities of mass deportation scheme are such that it's not realistic to think that they're going to find millions and millions of people that are here in the U.S. and try to deport them quickly. There just simply aren't the resources for that. So, I imagine there is going to be some sort of prioritization of who they're focusing on. And I don't think people who are here on humanitarian parole would be, the initial focus of any efforts along those lines. But losing status does make you removable from the United States. And so it makes sense to explore other legal and more permanent options for folks that are here on humanitarian parole. If people lose their status, and they don't have another underlying status already in the works, or they don't have status available to them, again, we don't know what the administration is going to do, if it's going to go after everyone that's ever applied for anything in immigration, or if it's going to focus its efforts. But typically, the people who are most vulnerable to being immediately placed in removal proceedings are people who have other problems like crimes or ties to groups that are of concern to the U.S. government, people who have been in removal proceedings before, maybe people who have outstanding removal orders. I imagine those will be the groups that are going to be most vulnerable. There is, and if someone is placed in removal proceedings, so if one of the people you're sponsoring loses their parole status and comes to the attention of the government and is placed in removal proceedings, they do have a right to a full and fair hearing before an immigration judge before being deported. There is something called expedited removal, which is for people who have been here for a short period of time. Currently, it's only applied near the border, but the Trump administration has indicated that they, under the last time they were in power, tried to expand the use of expedited removal to anywhere in the country, not just along the border. And in those situations, it's essential for them to have legal advice and to have an attorney who can assist them, because it happens very quickly, and the only way that they can stay is by showing that that they have a credible fear of persecution in their home country. And we'll get along to persecution shortly, but I think the short answer to your question, Liz, is that yes, that if people lose their parole status, they are at risk of being deported, and we don't know how serious that risk is and when that will occur. So it is wise to for all sponsors to be talking to their newcomers about their potential options for a more permanent type status beyond parole, and to try to get those pieces in place now rather than later.
Okay, thank you. And I know there's a lot of different possibilities and headlines that I'm sure people on this call have seen as well. Do you, sort of a follow-up to that, do you have any sense, just based off what we may have seen under the first Trump administration, as far as like how quickly things moved the first time, what we might see this time?
So Trump, when he took office last time, signed a slew of executive orders the first day in office. I imagine we could see some of that again. I think the focus is likely going to be on the border and, militarizing border patrol, really focusing on ending things that the Biden administration has done, which could include humanitarian parole. But we don't really know. I think that the only thing that is certain is that there will be changes made immediately, and we'll just have to sort of react as they happen.
Do you have any sense about how the US government would notify families that they are losing their status?
So that's a really good question. I think, what happened last time is there were, these executive orders signed, and then the government agencies that were responsible for various programs would, react to the executive order in trying to implement it, and would put on their website sort of what the change is. Another reason why it's important, I think, to get, if you don't have an attorney involved already, finding an immigration attorney or someone who can kind of advise you as things are happening, like what that means for you and for your newcomers that you've sponsored. Under the last Trump administration, it really was chaotic. It was hard for even immigration attorneys to keep up with all the changes. There's not a great way that the government has easily distributed information to people. There's a lot of misinformation in the media and things like that. So having a knowledgeable attorney who can kind of explain things that are happening as they come is really valuable. But generally, yes, I think, the government would put an announcement on their website. So humanitarian parole is through U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. So USCIS.gov should be a frequent website that you all are visiting. They put the announcements for their various programs up there on their website. And I imagine for individual people who've been granted parole, they would receive some form of communication, likely in the mail to their most recent address. So it's important to keep their addresses updated in the government system. Anytime someone moves that's a non-citizen, you have to file an AR-11 change of address. So if you don't file that form, you risk not receiving important communications about your status or your immigration case. So I would definitely recommend keeping your address updated.
That is a great point. Thank you for sharing that. I know we're going to get into the different options that may be available for the newcomers that we've welcomed, and not knowing what's going to happen, timing is in question. But can you share if someone is here on parole and is seeking a different legal status, what does the timing look like for that now? Can they do that now? Is that something that they have to wait to do, or does it depend on the option that you're looking at?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what I would recommend now is that that everyone schedule a consultation with an immigration attorney or a legal service provider who can do a holistic review of your newcomers' situation. That could include, who their family members are, where they're located, what their education and experience and skill set are like for potential employment-based options, what they're afraid of in their home country, the reasons why they need to be able to stay in the US. All of those things should be explored because there's a number of options that could be available to people that you're sponsoring, that could be applied for now. And you could initiate that process of getting people a more permanent status now. So I do recommend getting an individualized case-by-case assessment for your newcomers so that you can put a holistic plan in place to address their individual immigration situations, and to start doing that now, because everything with immigration takes a very long time, and having something else in the works if the parole program is ended and they lose their parole status will be a form of protection for them from being removed. So if they have another type of application pending, for example, that in itself is a type of protection from being removed. So getting those kind of plans in place now is really wise, and even starting to apply for things now before the new administration takes office. It's a lot harder for benefits to be taken away from people who have already relied on the benefit being available and applied. So in other words, laws and policy changes usually aren't applied retroactively to people who have already applied for those things. It just ends things for future applicants. So getting something filed now is a good idea because it's more likely that the benefit will still exist for them if they've already filed for an application.
Okay, that's great to know. And I can say that this is a new process for me, and I'm sure a lot of the people who are on the call with us today. So when my initial thought was to reach out to some contacts and see if they could put me in touch with an immigration lawyer, I didn't know anybody and I needed some guidance there. So if other people don't know where to start, don't know where to turn to start to make these decisions or help their newcomer family to make these decisions, where should they turn or what should they look for?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. And I think it's important to know that just because someone says they're an attorney or holds themselves out to be, a legal representative, doesn't mean that they're competent, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be ethical. And sometimes it doesn't mean that they're actually a licensed attorney. And so due diligence is really important as far as like getting the right help. And I know that's really hard for folks who, don't live in the legal world like I do. And so, where do you start? That's a really good question. So there is the Asylum Seekers Advocacy Project is a really useful organization, and we might reference them again later on when we're talking about asylum, but they have a find a lawyer section of their website, which has individualized links for nonprofit legal service providers, and also a search function for attorneys, reputable attorneys in your state. And so that's a really great starting point. The American Immigration Lawyers Association, AILA, is also another good starting point. They have a member directory on their website. It's ALA.org. And you can type in your geographic location and it'll pull up a list of attorneys who are members of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. Just because they're an ALA member doesn't mean that they're going to be a great attorney, though. So as much as I love ALA and support it, it's, you still have to do diligence beyond that, just looking into their reputation and all of that. But they do have a great search function. If someone's an ALA member, it means that they're serious about, doing their continuing legal education programs that are necessary. It means that they're in good standing, which means that they're in good standing with their state bar. And that's another important kind of threshold thing to look for when you're looking for an attorney. And I'm happy to make recommendations as well based on your geographic location. If you want to reach out to me directly, a lot of attorneys, and I know it's hard to find attorneys, especially if you're not in a big urban center. But a lot of immigration attorneys represent people nationwide. My firm does, for example, and given video conference links and the phone and everything, it's a lot easier to represent folks remotely now than it ever has been before. So even if you're in an area that doesn't have a lot of legal representation options available, there are people who can and will help you. And you can do consultations remotely very easily. So I think that's a great starting point for all of you, is to just get a consultation scheduled with a reputable attorney who can provide you with a plan. And that also helps because if you start the relationship with an attorney now, you have someone sort of on call, if you will, to explain things that are the changes that are coming up. And in case, worst case scenario, your newcomers somehow get, arrested or come to the attention of immigration authorities and you need to respond really quickly to efforts to remove them, then you already have a relationship established with an attorney who can kind of jump in and fight for your newcomers' rights and make sure that they're getting due process of law and the best opportunity to remain in the United States.
Thank you. And I know that I'm sure people are eager to hear about what some of those other options are that we would be reaching out to an attorney to talk about. So can you share a little bit about what we can look at as another legal status outside of humanitarian parole? And then we can get into a little bit more detail with each of those options.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll just give a brief summary of some various options. And then, yes, like Liz said, we can dig into them in more detail. So people who have come on for humanitarian parole have obviously come because of situations in their home countries that, that have made it difficult for them to be there, that, they've had to flee for one reason or another. In an urgent way. And so one option that they may be eligible for is something called asylum, which is protection that is granted by the US government for people who are fleeing persecution in their home countries. It's people basically who can meet the definition of refugee, who are already in the United States. There's another form of relief called temporary protected status, which is similar to asylum in that it provides protection for people who are physically here in the United States, but it's temporary relief. And instead of protecting people from persecution, it's to protect people from war, natural disaster, and other kind of generalized conditions that make it unreasonable to return someone to their home country. There's another thing called adjustment of status, which is a way for people to apply for permanent resident status in the United States, or a green card is what it's commonly referred to. And there's various forms or underlying ways to seek a green card, some through family relationships. So if people have US citizens or permanent resident family members in the United States, they could be eligible for a green card or adjustment of status. People who have certain skills as employees might have an employer who's willing to sponsor them for a green card. There's also for the Cuban population, there's a special avenue for them to become lawful permanent residents called the Cuban Adjustment Act. And then there's a number of temporary visas as well that people who are here on parole might want to explore. If they want to study, they could potentially get a student visa. If they have certain skills and qualifications, there might be temporary work visas that they're eligible for. And then there's another humanitarian visa called a U visa, if unfortunately your newcomers have been a victim of any kind of crime while they've been here in the United States. So there are a number of options that you'll want to explore thoroughly with an immigration lawyer who can kind of help you, again, put together a plan for your newcomers.
Okay, and so if I look at our newcomer situation and I feel like maybe asylum is the best route to go, how can I help them better understand how to pursue that and apply? And as a follow-up to that, can you share what benefits and risks there might be to applying for asylum?
Sure. So asylum is a type of protection for people who are in the United States who can't return to their home countries because they might be persecuted there. Persecution is a legal term of art. It means very serious harm that is targeted specifically at the applicant. And it has to be harm that's motivated by or it's because of a protected trait that the applicant embodies. And there's 5 protected traits: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and social group. And if your newcomer might be targeted because of their political opinion, for example, they might be eligible for asylum. Just to provide a couple of examples to make it easier to understand. So in Ukraine, for example, the Russian government and pro-Russian groups specifically have been targeting people of Ukrainian nationality. So that could be a potential ground for asylum. In Venezuela, to provide another example, the Maduro regime has been targeting members of opposition parties because of their political opinions or activities. So those are the sorts of things that might make someone eligible for asylum in the United States. The harm doesn't have to have already occurred. People can get asylum based on past persecution, but they can also get asylum if they have what they call a well-founded fear of persecution in the future. And well-founded fear can be as little as a 1 in 10 chance of their feared event happening. And so, a lot of people may be eligible for asylum, especially from the countries that have been designated for humanitarian parole. That being said, asylum isn't easy. It's not for people who just generalized victims of violence or generalized crime or bad economic situations or even discrimination. It has to be very targeted harm because of one of those protected traits that the person embodies. The harm also for asylum has to be either at the hands of the government of your newcomer's country or by groups that are operating within their country that the government either can't control or they have kind of allowed to operate or they're unwilling to control them. Groups like that might be other governments. So in Ukraine, it's arguable that the Ukrainian government has not been able to control the Russian operatives within Ukraine. Terrorist organizations as well. In Latin America, there's a lot of transnational criminal organizations that have sort of taken hold, and it's been really difficult for state governments to control them. So those are the type of actors we're talking about here. And let's see what else. While people are in parole status, they can apply for asylum. They don't have to wait to lose your parole, and they should do that if they have a viable claim. One thing that's important to remember with asylum is that There is a rule that people have to apply for asylum within 1 year of their entry to the United States. There's an exception for that, however, if people have been maintaining another status like parole. So you would want to, if your newcomer is maybe eligible for asylum, it makes sense to apply sooner rather than later, either while they're still in their valid parole or as soon as possible upon losing their parole in order to merit one of those exceptions. The process takes a really long time to apply for asylum. So getting that started sooner rather than later makes sense. People should work with an attorney because it is a very complex area of the law. The asylum application itself is a really complex form. The applicant also usually prepares a sworn declaration of their testimony, basically of everything that's happened to them in the past and all the things that they're afraid of in the future happening to them. Evidence of the conditions in their home country that would make their fears reasonable is also submitted, and any kind of documentation that verifies that their claims are true and accurate. That all gets submitted, and then after a long time, right now, we have a very long waiting line for an asylum interview. The individual would be interviewed by an asylum officer, and then a decision is made following the interview. While their application is pending, this is one of the benefits, they are able to apply for a work authorization. If after their application has been pending for 150 days, they can apply for their work authorization and then they can receive it 30 days after that. So once their application has been pending 180 days, they can receive the work permit. While the application is pending, another benefit is that they're here with authorization. And so having a pending asylum application is a form of protection against being removed or deported. They can't be deported until their claim has been heard and until there's been a final denial on their claim. If the asylum office denies the application or doesn't approve it, they refer it to the immigration court. And so that's one of the risks of applying, is knowing that if your newcomer is not in a valid status, so for example, if their parole ends and they're in the asylum seeking process and then the asylum office does not approve their application, they will automatically be referred to the immigration court for removal proceedings. However, they are able to make their claim anew in front of the immigration judge, and they have an opportunity to present their case all over again. If the judge also denies their claim, there's an appeal process as well. A lot of people from Ukraine and from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela will likely have valid claims to asylum and should seriously consider seeking legal advice and potentially applying for asylum as soon as possible. There's a lot of great resources online for people who want to apply for asylum. And I think, even though there is this risk of being put in removal proceedings, the benefits especially if someone has a valid claim, the benefits would outweigh any kind of risk along those lines. Again, them being here with authorization, being able to apply for a work permit after 150 days and receiving it after 180 days of their application pending. If asylum is granted, there's great benefits as well. They have a right to be here, to work here. They can travel on a refugee travel document. They can petition for their spouse and children to join them. And it is a full pathway to eventual U.S. citizenship. So it's a much more permanent option than parole is, for example. And the risk being that in applying, you may at some point be put before the immigration judge and need to make your claim before a judge. People should not apply for asylum if they don't have a true claim. There are very serious consequences in presenting a made-up story. If an asylum claim is found to be deliberately made up or a lie, then it could be found to be what they call frivolous. And if an asylum application is found to be frivolous, it means that the person is no longer going to be eligible for immigration benefits in the future in the United States. That being said, a weak claim is not a fabricated claim. And so as long as the claim, makes sense and isn't an invented story, then, it is worth considering applying for asylum and getting legal advice on that.
Thank you. I am learning a lot about this, and I'm sure everyone else on the call is as well. I really appreciated the examples that you provided because that made it a little more clear for me on some things that we can use to apply for asylum, as well as knowing that, when they are in the process of seeking asylum, that they are still in a safe space here. So I appreciate that very much. And I know that with all of that information, we've also dropped some of those resources in the chat so that people have some content to look at going forward. So thank you for that great overview of asylum and how we can use that going forward. And can you now take us into the next possibility, which is temporary protected status, or TPS, what that looks like compared to humanitarian parole, who that might be a good option for, and then what benefits and risks there might be for taking that path?
Sure. So temporary protected status, as I mentioned, it's a form of temporary immigration relief that is available for people from certain countries that have to be designated by the Department of Homeland Security. And usually the countries that are designated are those that are, have civil war going on, natural disasters, and other conditions that make it really unreasonable to expect people to return. It's for people who are already physically in the United States at the time the country's designated. It is the application process is a little bit complicated, so it's not as complicated as asylum, but it's still best to involve a lawyer because the individual who applies has to show that they're admissible, meaning that they're not, subject to certain things that would make them ineligible for temporary protected status. They have to register by a certain deadline, and the deadlines are, and the relevant dates are all country specific. So that's also where it can get a little complicated. But it's people from a designated country who have continually resided in the United States since a certain date and who have been continuously physically present in the United States since a certain date. And all the dates are listed on the USCIS website. They have a really detailed temporary protected status explainer page, and then they have sub pages of each designated country that list out all the requirements for each country in really useful charts. But the Haiti, Nicaragua, Ukraine, and Venezuela are all countries that are currently designated for TPS. Those designations do end, most of them in 2025. And so one of the, the downsides to temporary protected status is that the executive branch really has power here to designate a country or de-designate a country. And so it's a very easily politicized benefit. And we saw that under the last Trump administration, they moved to de-designate countries, including El Salvador, Haiti, Honduras, Nepal, Nicaragua, Sudan, and Syria under the last administration. The de-designations ultimately were enjoined by the courts, or at least stayed by the courts, meaning that they couldn't move forward with a de-designation because the way that the Trump administration had done that was found to be unlawful. And then when the Biden administration came in, they rescinded those de-designations. And so that's really the downside to TPS, is that it's really vulnerable, I think, to whoever's in charge. But it is a really useful benefit for people who qualify because you're protected from removal, you're eligible for work authorization, and you can even travel in some circumstances and re-enter the United States. So it's something to definitely consider. Again, especially if your newcomers are from Haiti, Nicaragua, Ukraine, and Venezuela, which are all designated countries currently. So it's worth exploring that as an option as well with an immigration attorney.
Okay, thank you. I do want to note that we are going a little bit over time, but we do have some great questions to get through. And so if anybody on the call needs to hop off, we are recording this and it will be available for you as a reference. And we'll get through as many of the questions today as we can. So I think the next possibility to talk through is the Cuban Adjustment Act. Can you share, of course, this is a pretty specific pathway, but can you share who can look to that as a next step after humanitarian parole? And again, sort of the benefits and risks of following that pathway.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so the Cuban Adjustment Act is an avenue for Cuban citizens or natives to become permanent residents or green card holders. It's for people who have been admitted or paroled to the U.S., who have been present for at least 1 year following that admission or parole. And it's a great benefit for Cubans because they don't have to meet other requirements for adjustment of status under the Immigration and Nationality Act that people from other countries have to meet. So it's a much easier process for Cubans to adjust than other nationalities, and it's worth exploring eligibility for that, since the Cubans that you've sponsored have been paroled in the U.S. And if they've been present in the U.S. for at least a year, they probably have potential eligibility for adjustment of status under the Cuban Adjustment Act.
Okay, great. And I understand that there are other things that can lead to other possible status options, such as case-specific information, looking at whatever the situation of the newcomer family might be. There might be other pathways available. Rather than getting into those options today, we will drop a few links in the chat so that our sponsors are aware of what's possible, such as employment-based or student visa options that I think you did reference earlier, and then can look to those resources for what is involved with those other pathways.
Yes, definitely. And just a quick note on that, I think, talking to your newcomers about, if they have family in the U.S. is just an important screening question. Mm-hmm. So, even you as sponsors can kind of screen for these issues, like for the U visa, have you ever been a victim of a crime in the United States, or have you ever had contact with the police in the United States is a good screening question. For family-based options, asking like, who are your family? Where are they? Are they U.S. citizens or permanent residents in the United States? And they might have a pathway. And then looking through their resume for any kind of, or talking with them about their education and background for employment is also a good starting point for that.
Okay, thank you. And getting toward the end of our questions, can you please share if the beneficiary is eligible for more than one application? Could they apply to multiple alternatives? And if they're doing that, does one application impact another?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So people can pursue multiple avenues for relief simultaneously, and they should do so if they're eligible. I think, with the uncertainties of the incoming administration, it makes sense to pursue all potential pathways to a more permanent status. So again, like having a very thorough conversation with a competent attorney makes sense to do at this point. And identifying, there's potential eligibility for these three things maybe. And so deciding what to apply for when, under the advice of an attorney is a great starting point. But again, you can apply for things at the same time. You can apply for things even though they're still in valid parole process or in valid parole status. And I think moving forward with as many pathways that are available to your newcomers as possible makes the most sense, because there's just so much uncertainty right now, and We don't know what's going to happen with parole. We don't know what's going to happen with TPS, for example, and asylum even. So I think there's a lot of unknowns. And so right now, getting as many things in process as possible makes sense.
Okay, thank you so much. I know there's a lot of information here to get through. I really appreciate your insight today, Dree, and I'm sure that the people on our call have gotten a lot of your expertise and your advice that they'll be able to share with their newcomer families moving forward. So thank you so much for that. And before I pass it off to Krista, I would just like to say from one sponsor to another that I recognize that this is really hard. And if you're anything like me, this is a lot of responsibility, and we have some hard conversations ahead, and I know that can be difficult. But I know what we're going to do is we're going to rely on what we chose to do as sponsors from the beginning, which is be a guide and be a resource and be a friend to the newcomer families that we welcomed here from the beginning. And there may be some difficult conversations or some awkward moments, but we will share with them this great information and other resources to help them make the best decision for their family moving forward. So I just want to thank you that, through the great moments and through the challenging ones, that you've been so dedicated to this work as a sponsor. And
Definitely.
I'll pass it over.
You guys are all an inspiration. You inspire me to keep doing my work, and I know you inspire so many people. So I just wanted to say one more thank you to all the sponsors out there. And also, please feel free to reach out to me as a resource. I'm happy to try to find connections for you all as you're trying to help your people. So thank you so much.
I really appreciate your time and your expertise. It's been incredibly helpful to me. So thank you. I'm going to pass it over to Krista to wrap us up.
Well, Liz and Dree, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, advice, compassion. We so appreciated this time together. We didn't get to all of your questions. You may have asked one and we didn't have the availability to get to your questions, but I hope that many of the resources we shared in the chat, which you will also be receiving in an email, will help you navigate and find answers to those questions. And also we use your questions to adapt and create new resources. This webinar was in response to a lot of questions that we've already received through previous engagements and in our inbox. So we're going to continue to iterate together, continue addressing your questions, and continue walking alongside you in this moment. Welcome.us is really committed to supporting this community we've built together and serving as a trusted resource and source of support for you. So thank you for being in this with us. We've got some next steps here on the screen. You'll see we encourage you to discuss alternative status options with the folks that you've sponsored, review these materials, this webinar, the links that you'll receive in your email about how to apply for alternative statuses, and then apply for all that your beneficiary with them are eligible for. And please share your feedback as we end the call. You'll see a survey pop up, and we would really value your feedback and input on how we can create more resources that are really helpful to you in navigating this journey that we're on together. So please share if this was helpful to you. Please share what else would be helpful to you as we navigate together. Thank you again for your time, and we'll see you soon.